The rain that evening was a kind of music, the sort that never required an audience and never stopped for applause. Oxford stones glistened beneath it, pavements holding the sheen of oil, and the reflections of lamps whose bulbs had not been changed in years. I walked slower than I needed to. The collar of my coat turned up, though I knew it would make little difference. There are days one finds oneself moving without hurry, simply to stretch the distance between what is expected and what must be endured. The case had not yet announced itself in any official manner. What I had instead were murmurs, a few lines in the evening paper, an overheard remark in the Randolph bar, a library assistant who said too much while pretending to tidy the card catalogue. Each fragment is insignificant. Together, however, they formed the faint outline of an intrusion into those things Oxford most values, its quiet certainties. It was Lewis who first drew me back to firmer ground. He had walked beside me for half a street before I noticed him, his umbrella a more practical shield than my stubborn indifference. He mentioned the discovery at St. Friddiswide's. A porter had found a woman seated in the cloisters long after midnight, her head inclined as if in prayer. By the time he approached, she had ceased all movement, and nothing could persuade her back to the world of the living. "Natural causes," said one voice. "Something else," suggested another. I felt the second voice linger. We walked on in silence for a time, and I let the wet rhythm of Lewis's footsteps carry me. What struck me oddly was the word choice in his account. Seated in the cloisters. Not collapsed, not slumped, but seated. The difference between dignity and despair. I imagined her, skirt hem gathering damp from the stone, hands placed with a deliberation that belonged to ceremony rather than accident. One does not arrange oneself so carefully when overtaken by mischance. At the Randolph later, I nursed a whiskey too long, letting it lose its bite, and considered the crossword abandoned on the bar. A clue stared at me, a place of refuge, 4 letters. I penciled in the answer without effort. Yet the word did not rest easy. I crossed it out and replaced it with a nest. Then later, port, each fit, none satisfied. It was then I realized the clue was less about the solution than the disquiet it provoked. A place of refuge is only such until it is discovered. I carried that thought with me into the Bodleian the following morning, where the damp smell of paper always reminds me of lives pressed thin and preserved. The librarian, an old acquaintance, whispered that the dead woman had been seen before in the Radcliffe camera. She never borrowed books, only sat in the shadows as if waiting for someone late. He remembered her gloves pale, almost white, inappropriate for winter. A detail too fragile to mean much, and yet I stored it carefully. It is often the colour of gloves, not the name in a ledger, that returns when memory is summoned. When I met Lewis again, his notes were orderly, his mind restless. He believed the porter's report too neatly aligned with a natural end. He used the phrase tidy death, as if such things existed. We stood in the quadrangle, rain still finding its way into our collars, and I told him that tidy was a word invented by those who dislike looking too closely. He smiled in that rueful way of his, knowing I had already begun the chase, even if the hounds had not yet been lost. There was one final certainty that day, though it came to me not from evidence, but from silence. In the cloisters of St. Friddiswide's, the echo lingers longer than the voice. I stood where she had sat, the stone still damp, and I felt the air press inwards. Not the absence of sound, but the weight of something withheld. A secret, perhaps, or only my imagination, which has misled me before. Still, I could not shake the conviction that whatever had happened here was not the quiet ending the college wished for. The rain followed me home that night, It ran along gutters, slipped beneath doors, and found its way into my thoughts. Certainties, after all, are rarely quiet for long. The first time I saw the college stairwell where the scholar had fallen, I thought less of tragedy than of architecture. The stone curled upward in a spiral that seemed designed not for ascent, but for introspection. One could almost imagine the steps whispering, "Go slower, look closer, remember how easily gravity reclaims us." The porter's lantern had left a dim halo on the floor where the body had been discovered, as if light itself had been reluctant to intrude upon that place. Lewis recited the facts with his usual steadiness, an elderly fellow, retired but still occupying a set of rooms with no immediate family, a few loyal students found at the base of the staircase by a scout bringing morning tea. The report claimed an accidental misstep, the sort of fate that can befall even the most careful of men when the hour is late and the stairs uneven. Yet I found myself doubting the simplicity of such a descent. The room he had left was still open, books turned as if he had been working until the hour when reason falters. I walked among the scattered pages, their margins lined with notes in a sharp, urgent hand, Greek mostly, a fragment from Sophocles repeated twice in the same line, as though emphasis had been demanded. I translated it softly to myself. Who sees too much must suffer. A warning, or only scholarship? One can never be certain. Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him nothing more than it seemed a curious choice of bedtime reading, but inside the word struck me as too pointed, the ink too recent. It is a habit of mine to notice pens, whether the ink flows heavily or dries into scratch. This one, I suspected, had not been laid down until minutes before the fall. Later in the quadrangle, I encountered a young woman hurrying with a stack of essays pressed against her chest. She avoided my glance, but not before I saw the tremor in her hand. A trivial observation, perhaps, but one I filed alongside the rest. The scholar had been her supervisor, I learned from Lewis. She had argued with him only days before, overheard by two others. Academic quarrels rarely extend beyond words, but words, as Sophocles knew, are sometimes sharpened into blades. At a luncheon in the hall, I studied the faces of the dons who sat in their appointed places, their voices echoing through the timbered roof. One remarked upon the untimeliness of the death, another upon the loss to the faculty. Yet what lingered was not grief, but a curiously measured relief, as though a weight had shifted. I found myself turning over a clue in the crossword beside my plate, unwanted burden, 5 letters. I wrote the answer quickly, onus, and then closed the paper before anyone could see. In the evening, I stood once more at the base of the stairwell. The rain had found its way through a gap in the window frame, leaving small dark patches along the steps. I followed them upward, each mark glistening like punctuation in a sentence half read. Near the top, where the banister turned, I noticed the faintest scratch along the stone, as if something metal had grazed against it. A ring, perhaps, or the edge of a watch. It might have been made by the scholar himself in his final struggle, or by another whose presence the record would not show. Lewis asked if I thought the man had jumped. I told him I doubted it. The papers on the desk had not been arranged with the finality of one preparing to leave. A suicide tidies, more often than not. This was the disarray of someone interrupted. Still, I did not declare it more than suspicion. Certainty is a dangerous indulgence at such an early stage. When I left the college, the night had thickened into silence. The lamps along the high street burned yellow against the rain, and the bells from Magdalen carried faintly over the rooftops. I thought of the line again, "Who sees too much must suffer," and I wondered if the scholar had glimpsed something that others wished concealed. A fall is easily explained, but the truth, like the rain, has a way of seeping through the smallest cracks. The quadrangle at St. Fridarswide's was one of those spaces that seemed to resist intrusion, even from its own members. High walls pressed the air into a permanent hush, and the grass, though meticulously trimmed, looked as though no foot had ever been permitted to wander across it. A place designed for order, but holding within its symmetry a curious suffocation. I stood there on a grey morning, the damp stone under my shoes, and felt as though the college had drawn in a breath and chosen not to release it. Lewis joined me with his notebook already open, his practical energy a quiet counterpoint to my own reluctance. He recited times, sightings, the routines of porters and scouts, each detail confined neatly within margins. But a quadrangle, I reminded myself, is not a timetable, it is a theatre, and its architecture dictates the play, every stair, every window, a vantage point, every closed gate, a silent alibi. The fellows had convened their meeting in the senior common room. I observed them with the detachment of a man solving a clue that refuses to yield. They spoke of their departed colleague in tones that drifted between dutiful respect and something colder. One, a mathematician, remarked that chance was often cruel. Another, a historian, corrected him with the word fate. I wondered which of them believed the fall was an accident, and which merely hoped for it. When Lewis asked the bursar about the stairwell light, the man replied that the bulb had been reported faulty for weeks. His voice held the indifference of one who knows that faults multiply faster than complaints. I watched his hands as he spoke. They stayed folded, except once when he smoothed his gown as if erasing an invisible crease. It was a minor gesture, easily overlooked, yet it lingered in my mind. One rarely straightens a garment unless something within feels askew. At luncheon, I wandered into the chapel. The organist was practicing, the notes climbing the stone like small birds trapped in a high vault. I sat for a moment in the dim light and thought of the scholars fall again. It is in human nature, perhaps, to imagine noise accompanying such an event, a cry, a thud, a shattering interruption. Yet in my mind it remained soundless, as if silence itself had conspired to push him down. Later, Lewis and I retraced the porter's route through the quadrangle. We paused at the far gate, which was bolted from within, and Lewis remarked that no one could have entered or left without notice. He seemed reassured by the containment, but I felt otherwise. A closed quadrangle does not prevent guilt, it merely concentrates it. The smaller the stage, the fewer the actors, and the more visible their hesitations. That evening, in my room, I attempted the crossword left unfinished in the paper. A clue caught me bound by duty, 6 letters. I tried to oblige, then tether, neither fitting the crossings. Finally, yoked revealed itself, with its curious mix of service and burden. I thought again of the bursar smoothing his gown, of the young woman trembling with her essays, of the dons speaking with too careful a cadence. Yoked, all of them, in ways unseen. Lewis telephoned to say that the coroner would most likely record misadventure. His voice carried the weight of resignation. I answered that misadventure was a convenient phrase, one that tidied untidiness. He chuckled, tired, and asked whether I ever accepted such things at face value. I told him the truth only when I was too weary to argue with myself. Before sleeping, I returned to the quadrangle. I pictured it empty, the lamps casting soft circles on the wet flagstones, the windows above dark, except for one, a single square of yellow light betraying a figure too restless to surrender to the night. That image stayed with me the sense of someone awake, watching, perhaps remembering. The closed quadrangle was not as closed as it wished to appear. Within its measured stillness, secrets moved quietly, waiting for the right ear to hear them. I have often thought that Oxford is less a city than a palimpsest, every face and facade layered upon what came before, none of it truly erased. Walk across a quadrangle, and you do not tread upon stone alone. You disturb the presence of those who crossed centuries earlier, voices faint but not absent. It was in such a mood I found myself that evening, returning again to the rooms once occupied by the scholar, whose fall continued to gnaw at my mind. The college had left his papers untouched, as though to disturb them would be an admission that death had any permanence. I traced a finger along the spines of his books, their dust unbroken, their titles as solemn as epitaphs. Between two volumes I noticed an envelope folded flat, its flap unsealed. Inside was not a letter, but a photograph of 4 men in academic dress, their expressions fixed in the pride of some earlier triumph. One of them was our scholar, younger, the intensity in his eyes less softened by years. Of the other 3 I recognized only one, the bursar, though with a fuller head of hair and a less guarded smile. Lewis stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. He muttered something about reunions, about how academics collect old comrades like schoolboys. I did not answer. My attention had moved to the hand of the man on the left, a ring so large it seemed ostentatious, carved with a crest I half remembered from some dusty heraldic reference. The sort of detail most would ignore, but to me it carried a faint echo, as though a half-solved crossword clue had brushed against memory. I asked Lewis whether the college still held records of fellowships from the 70s. He frowned, said it would take time to dig them out. I told him time was precisely what we had, though even as I said it I knew how untrue that felt. Death alters the tempo of all things, quickens what should be slow, slows what should be urgent. In the days that followed, I wandered more than investigated. The library absorbed me, its corridors whispering with unseen footsteps. One afternoon, I paused beside a reading desk where a student, oblivious to my presence, was working through a translation. His pencil hovered as he mouthed the line the past walks beside us, unseen yet unyielding. I could not help but smile at the coincidence. Later, over a drink at the King's Arms, Lewis asked what haunted me about a simple fall. I told him nothing in Oxford was simple. Every stone concealed a footnote. He shook his head, amused in that patient way he reserved for my less linear musings. But as he lifted his glass, I noticed his glance drift across the room toward a man seated alone in the corner. Grey-haired, neat, his posture alert despite his years. A face I had seen before, though it took me a long moment to place it. He was in the photograph. The ringed hand is now bare, but the set of the mouth unchanged. I did not approach him. Some encounters are better left to ripen in their own time. Instead, I returned home and unfolded the crossword once more. The clue that waited was ghosts. 7 letters I tried, spectre, phantom, both plausible. Only when the letters aligned did the word shadows take its place. Figures in the past, not gone but dimmed, shaping the contours of the present without ever fully declaring themselves. That night I dreamed of the stairwell again. The scholar descended, not falling, his hand brushing the stone where the scratch had marked it. Behind him, unseen, another figure, silent, following. When I woke, the dream did not vanish, it clung like smoke. The photograph lay on my desk where I had left it. 4 men, linked by time, ambition, and something darker perhaps. One now dead, another watching from a corner of a pub, the rest waiting to be named. Oxford's history is never merely archived, it presses forward, insists upon notice, and I, unwilling though I may sometimes be, am condemned to listen. The scholar's desk had remained as he left it, a landscape of unfinished thoughts and marginalia that spoke more clearly than any formal report could. A candle stub had hardened into a pool of wax against the rim of an ashtray, and beside it a sheaf of papers filled with cramped notation. Mathematics, not my discipline, though the language of unfinished work has its own universal grammar interruptions in mid-line, the uncharacteristic hesitation of a hand that usually writes with certainty. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, his impatience showing in the rhythm of his breath. He asked what I could make of it. I told him very little. Yet I traced my finger along the final page, where the ink had faltered just before the conclusion. It seemed to me less an error than a withdrawal, as though the writer had been called suddenly away, or else unsettled by what he had seen forming beneath his own pen. An unfinished proof is rarely only mathematics, it is confession interrupted. The college porter mentioned a visitor that evening, a man tall, well-dressed, who did not give his name, but asked directions to the scholars' rooms. I wondered aloud why such a detail had been omitted from the first accounts, and the porter explained, with the weariness of a man accustomed to being overlooked, that no one had asked him. Lewis muttered something about procedure. I said nothing. In investigation, as in crosswords, it is often the clue excluded that matters most. Later I sat in the college library. The hush of turning pages and the faint crack of heating pipes accompanied my reading of the scholars' earlier publications. One essay caught my attention. Discussion of paradoxes, the impossibility of proving what resists completion. He had written that proof is a prison, its elegance binding one to certainty. I read the line twice and thought how close it lay to my own unease with conclusions. Certainty may be neat, but it is rarely honest. At the pub that evening, Lewis asked whether I thought the unfinished pages pointed to despair. I told him I doubted it. A man bent on ending his life does not stop mid-sentence. He finishes first, ties the bow, makes the gesture tidy. What I saw instead was the opposite, a mind interrupted, perhaps deliberately. Lewis frowned, saying I was seeing ghosts again. I replied that Oxford has no shortage of them, and some still wear gowns. The crossword that night offered me a small reprieve. Interrupted work, 4 letters. I tried a task, then a duty. Neither satisfied until the letters fell into place, a word weighted by both music and mathematics, by creation and incompletion. I circled it, wondering if the scholar had thought the same as his pen slowed, aware that an opus left unfinished is both tragedy and legacy. The following morning I revisited the stairwell. The rain had dried, but the scratch along the stone remained. I measured it again with my eye, too high for a stumble, too deliberate in its curve, not the mark of descent, but of resistance, a hand catching, dragging, leaving behind its protest. The details stirred unease, for it suggested a struggle unacknowledged in the neat coroner's phrase. I returned to the papers once more before leaving. On the margin of the final sheet, almost hidden beneath a fold, was a small note in Latin quid restat. What remains? A phrase both bleak and open. It might have been a scholar's habitual flourish, or it might have been something else entirely, a message not yet ready to be read. When I stepped out into the quadrangle, the air was damp with the promise of rain. Students hurried by, their gowns trailing behind them, voices quick and bright, untouched by the shadow lingering in the stairwell. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke mingle with the mist, thinking how every unfinished proof insists upon a reader, someone willing to follow the thread where it frays, and whether I wished it or not, that someone had already become me. It is a curious flaw of mine that I sometimes delight too soon in the elegance of an answer. The mind, weary of circling shadows, longs for a shaft of light, however premature. That week, I thought I had found it. The visitor reported by the porter became my pivot, A tall man, well-dressed, his name withheld, but his manner unmistakably that of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I pictured him in the stairwell, the scholar already hesitant, their words low but heated. The struggle, the scratch along the stone, the abrupt fall. It fit with a neatness that both comforted and deceived me. Lewis, ever practical, agreed. He said we should look for a man with reason to silence the scholar. Some debt unsettled, some secret imperiled. It was plausible enough. We drove out to a boarding house on Iffley Road, where a lodger answering loosely to the description had been seen. I questioned him at length about the greying temples, the sharp eyes, the ring that left its faint indent even when removed. He denied knowing the scholar and denied setting foot in St. Fridswide's. His voice was calm, his gaze unwavering, a denial so steady that I wanted to believe the opposite. Afterwards, over pints at the Angel and Greyhound, Lewis declared that we had our man. He spoke of opportunity, motive, the unspoken logic of power and intimidation. I listened, but something in me recoiled. It was too soon, too clean. A crossword clue solved without crossings is always suspicious. I scribbled one from the paper in front of me, 5 letters. The answer came easily enough. But the word, once written, mocked me. To seem is not to be. The following morning I returned alone to the college. The quadrangle was hushed, its gravel walks damp with drizzle. I entered the scholars' rooms once more. The unfinished proof lay unchanged, but I lingered this time over the margins, the crossings, the double underlines. One annotation caught me a phrase in English, rare amid the Latin and Greek. Not yet. Not yet. 2 words that could mean postponement of work, or postponement of speech, or simply hesitation before the inevitable. If the scholar had been threatened that evening, why pause to write those words? Why not cry for help or leave a warning? The detail unsettled my earlier certainty. Lewis brought news later that day the lodger had a solid alibi for the time of death, corroborated by 3 others. My supposed assailant had been nowhere near the cloisters. The ring, the sharp eyes, the commanding manner are all coincidences. Lewis was apologetic, though not surprised. He had known me long enough to expect my eagerness for the wrong solution, at least once per case. I answered with silence. Inside, however, I felt the sting of my own impatience. That night the rain came hard against my window, a steady percussion that made sleep impossible. I returned to the crossword abandoned on the table. Another clue confronted me. Error, 7 letters. I made a mistake, then blunder, neither fit. At last, the letters resolved into a misstep. I closed the paper, slowly. A misstep on the stairs, in thought, in judgment. The word seemed to belong as much to me as to the scholar. When dawn arrived, I walked through Jericho, the streets still glistening, the air sharp with wet brick. I thought of the man in the boarding house, innocent of this matter, guilty perhaps of others, but not of this. I thought of the scholar, his proof unfinished, his hand marking the margin with those 2 words. Not yet. And I thought of myself, too willing to close the book before the final page. The first false solution had been tempting in its symmetry, irresistible in its logic, but Oxford rarely permits truth to be so direct. It wraps its secrets in parchment, tucks them into shadows, leaves them to be discovered slowly, if at all. And I, chastened once more, would have to begin again. There are silences peculiar to libraries, not the mere absence of sound, but a density of quiet that presses against the skin, the kind of silence that seems to accuse the intruder of bringing with him the noise of the world outside. That morning I carried such noise in with me, the grind of unanswered questions, the false solution already discarded, the faint ache of a night without rest. The Radcliffe camera was dim beneath its dome. dust lingered in the columns of light, shifting like pale ghosts unsettled by the movement of readers. I had asked to see the scholars' borrowing records, and a reluctant assistant led me through the catalogues. The pages were dog-eared, the entries written in a hurried hand. What struck me most was the gap, a silence not in sound but in ink. Weeks without borrowing where once there had been daily entries, as if the scholar had withdrawn not merely from people, but from words themselves. Lewis appeared beside me, his footsteps awkward on the old boards. He muttered that perhaps the man had finished with books. I told him, "No one ever finishes with books, they finish with you." He sighed, accustomed to my curmudgeonly replies, and waited while I traced my finger along the missing lines of the ledger. 1 gap is oversight, 2 is chance, but 3 is intent. I sat later in the north reading room, where the smell of paper hung like a sacrament. Students bent over their essays, some scribbling, some staring, others pretending to work while their eyes wandered the room. My attention fell upon a young man whose notes spilled untidily across the table. He tapped his pen against his lip, paused, and underlined a passage twice, then once more, unnecessarily. The gesture was familiar. I had seen it in the scholar's own notebook's repetition as emphasis or as concealment. One doubles a line when one cannot quite decide whether to draw it at all. Lewis whispered whether I had discovered anything. I told him nothing certain, though in truth certainty was not what I sought. Instead I lingered on the student's hand, the ink smudged along his fingers, the faint murmur that betrayed nerves rather than carelessness, an echo, perhaps, of his tutor. The dead do not vanish, they seep into the gestures of those they leave behind. Later I asked the assistant whether the scholar had ever requested restricted works. She hesitated before nodding. Yes, he had, though she would not say which. I pressed gently, but her silence hardened. Some loyalties are stronger than regulations. As she turned away, I noticed the smallest detail, the ink on her thumb fresh, as though she had blotted something not long before. A trivial observation, yet I kept it. Small smudges often stain the larger canvas. Back in my room that night, I unfolded the crossword. The clue that caught me was the sound of nothing, 6 letters. I tried mutism, vacuum, each unsatisfactory. Then at last, silence. Too obvious, perhaps, yet in its obviousness lay its sting. Silence is not absence, it is presence disguised. I thought of the missing borrowings, the crossed lines in the margin, the assistant's thumb dark with ink. Each spoke of something left unsaid. The library silence was not empty, it was full, crowded with withheld truths. Lewis telephoned. He said the coroner's report was ready, that we should attend. I told him we would. My voice sounded flat, detached. He asked if I was unwell. I answered that the library had left me weary, though in truth it was not weariness, but weight. To listen to silence is harder than to endure noise. I poured a whiskey and stood at the window. The rain had begun again, smearing the lamplight into trembling halos. I thought of the scholar walking through the Radcliffe's doors for the last time, carrying nothing, leaving nothing but the absence of ink in the ledger. Silence written into the record more indelibly than words. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether I too was guilty of leaving silences where speech should have been. The dead have their unfinished proofs, the living have their unfinished confessions. Both linger, waiting for someone to read them. The evening had the weary comfort of routine. A bottle opened, the glass filled, the amber liquid held against the lamplight before the first sip. Wine is less about taste than about memory. Each mouthful drags something back, often unwelcome, sometimes unbearable. That night, the memories tasted sharper than the tannins. Lewis had accompanied me earlier to the King's Arms. He had insisted on food. and I had insisted on wine. Between us, the conversation drifted in circles. He believed the scholar had collapsed beneath the strain of his unfinished work. I told him men do not die of equations, not unless another hand pushes them to the edge. He looked at me with a sadness I pretended not to see. We drank, we parted. Alone in my room, the rain tapping faintly against the window, I unfolded the crossword. A clue awaited remorse, 7 letters. I tried repents, then regrets, neither fit with the crossings. At last the letters slid into place of sorrow. I left it uninked. Some words are too blunt, too unrelieved of meaning. I thought again of the photograph discovered among the scholars' papers of 4 men frozen in their younger triumphs, the bursar, the man in the pub, the others still unnamed. I studied their faces in memory, and it seemed to me that time had not erased the expressions but deepened them. One smiled too easily, another not at all. The scholar himself looked as though he already knew what would come, though such knowledge belongs more to hindsight than to prophecy. The wine dulled my tongue, but not my thoughts. I remembered the assistant in the library, her ink-stained thumb, her silence when I pressed her. I remembered the student tapping his pen, underlining too much. These fragments circled me like moths round a flame I was too tired to feed. The truth, whatever shape it took, hovered just out of reach. I poured another glass and thought of Lewis again. He carries his work with a steadiness I have never managed. For him, cases are puzzles with solutions. For me, they are wounds that never quite close. Perhaps that is why I reach too soon for the false solution, too desperate to stanch the bleeding. Perhaps that is why regret has settled into me more firmly than certainty ever could. There was a knock on the door of a neighbour, too drunk to find his own key. I sent him away with irritation, though as I closed the door, I thought of the irony. Wine leads some to confession, others to concealment. I wondered which it had been for the scholar on that final night. Did he drink to steady his hand or to silence his tongue? I returned to the desk, the crossword still waiting. Another clue, a heavy burden, 5 letters. I penciled in cross, then hesitated. Cross. It seemed too obvious, too moral, yet the word carried weight. A burden, yes, but also a puzzle. Each cross demanding an answer, each answer binding one further. I closed the paper again. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's struck 11. The sound stretched across the city, pulling with it a wash of regret. I thought of all the conversations left unfinished with the scholar, with the woman in gloves, with myself. Silence is easier than speech, yet it leaves its stains behind like wine on paper, spreading wider with time. The bottle had lowered to its heel when I realized the simplest of deductions. The scholar's final note quid restat, what remained, was not only philosophy, it was instruction. A proof, unfinished demands continuation, not abandonment. Perhaps he had entrusted that continuation to another. Perhaps the silence was not his choice but theirs. I left the thought unresolved, as all thoughts are at that hour. The rain continued, soft against the window, and the glass in my hand felt heavier with each sip. Wine does not comfort, it excavates. And what it unearthed in me that night was the recognition that regret, unlike proof, is never finished. It lingers, it accumulates, and it waits at the bottom of the bottle. It was Lewis who gave me the key to my second mistake, though he did so without meaning to. He had been speaking with the student, the one whose hand trembled as he underlined his notes too many times. The boy admitted haltingly that he had quarrelled with the scholar. Accusations of favoritism, of plagiarism even, muttered in the heat of resentment. To Lewis it was motive enough. To me it was an echo I wanted too much to hear. We walked together through the quadrangle that afternoon, drizzle softening the outlines of stone. Lewis said, The boy had an opportunity. He had visited his tutor's rooms late. He had left in anger, and the porter, though uncertain, thought he might have seen him pass under the cloisters near the hour of death. Each piece fits snugly against the next, as though the puzzle at last arranged itself willingly. I allowed myself to feel the grim satisfaction of conclusion. That evening I questioned the student alone. He was pale, his voice subdued, but his eyes, when raised, held defiance. He admitted to the quarrel. He admitted to leaving papers scattered on the desk in frustration. He did not admit to the push that would have been so simple in that narrow stairwell. I pressed, quietly, as one does when the silence is heavier than words. He faltered once, his hand lifting to his brow as though wiping away sweat not there. A guilty gesture, I thought. But later, alone, I wondered whether it was only the natural reflex of a boy overwhelmed by grief. Back in my room, I poured a whiskey and turned to the crossword. A clue lingered at the bottom. Too easy, 4 letters. I filled in glib. The word stung me. The case had become glib in my mind, a quarrel, a fall, a tidy explanation. Yet tidiness is rarely true. Lewis remained convinced. He spoke of recommending charges, of passing the matter upward. I nodded, but doubt returned, as doubt always does with me, not in grand revelations, but in small recollections. The bursar smoothing his gown, the assistant's thumb darkened with ink. The scholar's final words in the margin are not yet. None of these belonged to the student. They belonged to older hands, to slower minds, to shadows long cast the boy ever raised his pen. I revisited the stairwell once more. The scratch along the stone mocked me, too high for a stumble, too deliberate for chance. I imagined the student's slight frame, his narrow shoulders, and I doubted. The force required to leave such a mark did not come from a boy consumed with essays and grievances. It came from someone more practiced in the weight of things. That night, Lewis and I argued. He told me I was blinded by sympathy, that I saw too much of myself in the student, the restless dissatisfaction, the desire for approval, never given. Perhaps he was right. I said little in reply. I merely raised my glass and drank. Silence has always been my preferred weapon, though it wounds me as much as anyone else. When Lewis left, I opened the crossword again. Another clue, wrong answer, 5 letters. I tried an error, then a false one. At last, lying fit the crossings. I stared at the word for a long while, knowing it belonged not only to the case but to myself. The next morning I released the student. No charges. Lewis was displeased, but he did not protest further. I told him only that the truth remained unfinished like the proof on the scholar's desk, and that to close it prematurely would be to write the wrong answer in ink that could not be erased. Oxford, that evening, was hushed beneath rain, the lamps glowing like weary sentinels. I walked alone, hearing my footsteps echo against the stone. The second false solution had slipped away, leaving behind only the faint taste of shame, as wine does when the glass has been emptied too often. The truth, I knew, was still waiting. Not in the boy's trembling hands, but elsewhere in the silences that lingered, in the faces that avoided my gaze, in the gestures too easily forgotten. I had failed again, but failure is often the surest path toward recognition. The second false solution was behind me, but the weight of it remained, pressing into the night like the damp that seeps beneath doors. It is always the small things that persist, the smudge on a page, the echo of a gesture, the phrase half forgotten until it will not leave you. Grand theories collapse under their own weight, but a minor detail endures, insistent, waiting to be heard. I had thought of little else that day. Lewis spoke of closing the file, of writing his report in the tidy language that bureaucracy loves. He was weary of my hesitations, and perhaps he was right to be. Yet the thought of conclusion sat wrong with me, as though a door had been closed on a room I had not yet entered. The minor detail was the gloves, pale, almost white, noticed by the librarian in the Radcliffe camera. At first I had dismissed it as eccentricity. But gloves of such colour are impractical for winter. They soil too easily, draw the eye too readily. And why wear them in a library where the only dirt is dust? I thought of them again and again, as if they were the scholar's final annotation left for me to read. That evening I walked once more into the quadrangle. Rain darkened the stone and the lamps trembled in their halos. I retraced the porter's path, paused at the stairwell, and ran my fingers along the scratch in the stone. My mind returned to the gloves, to the student's trembling pen, to the bursar's smoothing of his gown. Fragments, nothing more, but each fragment insistent. In the senior common room I spoke with the dons again. Their words blurred into one another, but their silences did not. One, when I asked of the scholar's visitors, lowered his gaze to his untouched sherry. Another remarked too quickly that he had not seen the man for days before his fall. These evasions, subtle but clear, were worth more than their words. And then a gesture, the bursar once again smoothing his gown, his thumb running over a faint patch near the hem, a patch lighter than the rest, as though a stain had been hurriedly erased. Later at home I opened the crossword. The clue stared at me, overlooked 5 letters. I penciled small, then minor, both wrong. At last, slight fit, slight. A word meaning delicate, but also dismissive. The slight thing, the overlooked thing, the minor detail. The crossword mocked and guided me both. I thought again of the scholar's desk, the final note in the margin quid restat what remains. Perhaps he had left more than unfinished lines of mathematics. Perhaps he had left me these minor details, scattered like crumbs across stone and paper. Not yet, he had written. Not yet finished. Not yet solved. Lewis called. He asked whether I would accept the coroner's verdict at last. I told him I could not. He sighed, said I would drive myself into silence one day. Perhaps he was right. Silence has always been both my ally and my enemy. When the night grew late, I poured a glass of wine and stared out into the rain. I saw the scholar seated in the cloisters, his hands deliberate, his head bowed as if in prayer. I saw the faint scratch on the stairwell, the pale gloves shifting in the dim light, the bursar's restless hand upon his gown, minor details each one, but together they pressed upon me with a weight heavier than any proof. I did not know then where they would lead, nor do I claim certainty even now. But I knew, with the kind of knowledge that resists dismissal, that the truth lay not in the grand explanations we had sought, but in the overlooked, the slight, the minor. Oxford teaches that permanence resides in stone and ceremony, but it is not so. It resides in the detail, in the smudge of ink, the scratch on stone, the tremor of a hand. Those are the things that remain when the rest has been tidied away. And as I closed my eyes that night, the rain steady against the window, I told myself what the scholar had written. Not yet. What remains? The case was not over. A minor detail had seen to that. Confession rarely comes in daylight. It prefers the darker hours when the mind slackens its grip, and the tongue, half loosened by fatigue or drink, lets slip what it has held too long. Yet the confession I recall now was not spoken plainly. It came in fragments, gestures, the half-lit murmur of a man unwilling to step fully into truth. I had arranged to meet him in the chapel. The bursar, though I had ceased to think of him solely in that capacity, had agreed to speak after complying when the building was near deserted. He sat in the rear pew, his gown drawn tightly round his shoulders, the faint scent of incense still hanging in the stone. I approached without hurry, my footsteps echoing more loudly than I wished. He did not look up. He began, not with words, but with a sigh, the kind that seems to empty more than lungs. He spoke of the scholar, of their friendship, once bright, later clouded. He said there were debts of honor, debts of silence. He said the man had asked too many questions, pressed too far into matters better left undisturbed. His voice did not rise, did not falter. It flowed as though rehearsed, though the pauses betrayed him. I asked whether he had visited the rooms that evening. He shifted, his hand brushing the hem of his gown, the same gesture I had noticed before. He said he had gone to speak, to settle a matter long unresolved. He did not say more. But in the shadowed chapel, with the candlelight trembling on stone, it was enough. Lewis would later ask what had been confessed. I told him less than the truth, more than a lie. For what I heard that night was not admission but suggestion, not guilt but regret. And regret is slipperier than sin. It cannot be nailed to a verdict. I left him there, still seated, his head bowed as though in prayer. Outside, the quadrangle was heavy with mist. I thought of the scholar again, seated in the cloisters in almost the same position. The living and the dead mirrored each other, shadows cast across time. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword. A clue stared at me. Half-told story, 6 letters. I tried a secret, then a rumor. Neither satisfied until legend fit, the word carrying both truth and fabrication in equal measure. That was the nature of the bursar's confession, half-told, suspended between fact and fable. I poured a whiskey and considered whether I had the right to press further. A confession offered in shadow is like a candle flame, fragile, flickering, easily snuffed. To demand clarity might extinguish it altogether, and yet without clarity the truth remains unfinished like the proof left on the scholar's desk. Lewis telephoned later. He asked whether we were nearer to resolution. I told him only that Oxford had given me a story, not an answer. He sighed, weary, and said that stories do not satisfy coroners. I replied that they satisfy ghosts, which in Oxford matters rather more. The night deepened. Rain began against the glass, slow and patient. I closed my eyes and recalled the bursar's hand, brushing his gown, smoothing its invisible crease. I thought of the pale gloves, the ink-stained thumb, the student's trembling pen. Each detail part of a confession, never wholly spoken. What remains with me is not certainty but the atmosphere, the dim chapel, the flicker of candles, the voice that hovers between guilt and sorrow. A confession in shadow, never recorded, never witnessed, and yet more binding than any signed statement. I cannot say with honesty whether the bursar killed his friend, but I know, with a knowledge beyond proof, that he carried the weight of something that night, and that weight had bent his shoulders long before the fall in the stairwell. Confession, in the end, is less about crime than about burden. He unburdened himself in shadow, and I, unwilling priest, listened. The words linger still, unfinished, unanswered, like the scholar's proof, like my own life. It is an odd phrase, proof beyond doubt, as though doubt were a door one could close firmly and finally, leaving the room secure behind it. My experience has been otherwise. Doubt lingers like smoke in the curtains, invisible but impossible to cleanse. Still there are moments when the pattern of things sharpens, and one sees with uncomfortable clarity that a line has been crossed, a balance tipped. The morning after the bursar's half-confession, I returned once more to the scholar's rooms. The air was stale, heavy with paper and the faint trace of tobacco. The unfinished proof remained on the desk, its ink grown no less accusatory for having dried. I sat before it and let my eyes wander the page. Symbols, equations, the skeleton of an argument reaching for completion. And in the margin, faint but legible, the phrase he had written quid restat, what remains. I thought of the bursar smoothing his gown, of the ink-stained thumb of the assistant, of the pale gloves in the library. All small things, all minor details, yet together they formed their own theorem, a proof, not of mathematics, but of human frailty. Lewis joined me there, his patience worn thin. He asked if I intended to chase ghosts forever, if I could not accept what everyone else seemed willing to say, that the scholar had slipped, misstepped, fallen as men do when age conspires with chance. I told him no, a misstep does not write, not yet in a margin. A misstep does not invite a visitor at midnight. He shook his head, said, I wanted the world too complicated. Perhaps he was right, but Oxford is complicated, and men are too. Later, walking through the quadrangle, I recalled a trivial moment, one I had almost dismissed. The porter's remark about the faulty stairwell light. He had said it had been reported weeks before, but no one had repaired it. I remembered the bursar, his casual indifference when Lewis asked about it. Too casual, the kind of indifference rehearsed to conceal attention rather than to express neglect. The bursar had known that the light was faulty. He had known it, and he had left it so. That evening the crossword in the paper offered me a clue. Without question, 5 letters. I tried clear, then plain. Neither fit. Only proof satisfied the crossings. Proof. Not the scholar's mathematical kind, but the darker, human variety. Proof beyond doubt, though not beyond ambiguity. I did not seek the bursar again. There was no need. His shoulders had already confessed, bent beneath their own weight. His silence in the chapel had spoken louder than any declaration. And perhaps more important than his words was my own recognition that I had ceased to need them. Proof, for me, had always been less about evidence than about conviction, and I was convicted enough. Lewis remained uneasy. He wanted documents, statements, dates. I wanted none of those. I wanted only to sit with the scholar's papers, to trace the fading ink, to imagine his hand halting on the line. What remains? Not yet. Each phrase seemed directed at me personally, as if he had known someone would come looking, someone unwilling to leave silence unexplored. In Oxford, truths are rarely paraded in daylight. They sit in cloisters, they whisper in libraries, they hover in the scrape of chalk or the smudge of ink. Proof here is never neat, but it is binding all the same. That night I poured a final whiskey and looked out, across the city. The lamps burned softly through mist, and the bells of Magdalen tolled across the roofs. I thought of the scholar, the bursar, the photograph of 4 young men with their lives ahead, ambition, friendship, betrayal, the same elements shuffled endlessly like letters in a crossword, waiting to form words one never quite expects. Proof beyond doubt. I had found it, and yet doubt remained. Perhaps that is the only honest resolution one can claim, to hold both proof and doubt together as Oxford itself holds past and present, stone and rain, silence and confession. What remains then? Only this scholar's fall was no accident, and the detail that proved it was so small, so ordinary, that it might have been overlooked entirely, but it was not overlooked. Not by me.